Hi, my name is Dr. Donna Ionel. I am a board certified neurologist and headache specialist, and today we're going to be talking about elimination diets and migraine. The term elimination diet has a few different definitions depending on who you talk to. So sometimes in the headache world, elimination diet is referring to trying to identify any food triggers that you might have and then removing those from your diet to see if that helps your migraine attack frequency. And then sometimes in the general world and in the allergen world, we talk about elimination diets in regards to food allergies. So things like dairy, nuts, any kind of common allergens that people might have, and removing those to see if they help inflammation in the body or gastrointestinal or GI symptoms like nausea, bloating, and other symptoms like that. So in the migraine and headache world specifically, most of the time elimination diet, we're talking about foods and drinks that have maybe been identified as a typical trigger for a large population of people. Some examples of food triggers that have been associated with migraine are things like caffeine, alcohol, cheese, processed meats, chocolate, and then MSG, which is a food additive. In terms of research backing these, the hard part about research with food triggers is that there's a lot of what we call recall bias, where basically folks will have a migraine attack. They'll look back at that day and say, well, what did I do differently that day? Was it my sleep? Was it the weather? Or was it what I ate? And then when folks look back at what they ate, they see a lot of these common foods and they say, oh my gosh, well, that day I ate chocolate. That must have been what caused it. In terms of what the research actually tells us, it seems that caffeine and alcohol are pretty consistent triggers for folks. And outside of that, the other foods that I mentioned, it's kind of hit or miss. And again, there's that risk of recall where you're trying to find out what you might have done differently that day. And in general, we are kind of moving towards thinking about food triggers versus food cravings. And so to talk about the research and kind of the science behind this a little bit. So a migraine attack goes in phases. And the first phase of a migraine attack is the prodrome or the premonitory phase. So this is typically when someone might feel off, but they're not really sure why. There might be a lot of fatigue. There might be a lot of thirst. And then one big thing that can happen is food cravings. And so we get into this cycle where we crave something, we eat it, we proceed through the migraine attack and the pain, and then we look back and say, well, it must have been that food, when it might have actually always been the case that you were going to have a migraine attack. I think one of the biggest myths and misconceptions about elimination diets is that there is really one size fits all. So we talked about how a lot of folks will think, well, it must be chocolate, cheese, alcohol, caffeine. But what the research tells us is that food triggers are very variable. So not only can food triggers vary across age, so maybe what used to trigger an attack when you were younger no longer triggers it when you're older. So not only do they vary within the same person, but they also vary between people. So what triggers one person may not trigger another. And so the hard part about recommending an elimination diet that's the same for every person is that it's not one size fits all. There have been a few randomized controlled studies in elimination diets that were actually based off of allergy testing. So testing something called IgG. And so basically in these studies, they had folks go or eat their regular diet, log their frequency. They had folks eat a modified diet that had some of these low grade food sensitivities. And then they had folks eat a provoking diet where they ate the foods that they were very sensitive too. And what those studies showed was that the folks that ate or eliminated the things that they had high allergens to, they had less severe attacks, less frequent attacks, and the attacks were overall shorter in duration. So, in regards to the blood food sensitivity tests that you can find commercially, so through the market, like online, there may be some benefit to doing them, but I would use caution because sometimes what you might have a mild reaction to may not actually be something that you're clinically having symptoms to. So my personal opinion about that would be that if you are having a lot of gastro symptoms, so not just migraine, but having some other symptoms and you're worried that food might be part of that, if it's within your budget to do one of those commercially available tests, I think that it's something that you could try, but with the caveat that you should be careful that you're not using those as the end all be all, because again, what might be sometimes causing some mild GI symptoms may not be related to your migraine attacks, and you'd get into a rough situation if you're eliminating a lot of foods that maybe you need nutritionally that might not actually be causing a lot of symptoms. There have been a few randomized controlled trials where basically they had folks that didn't change their diet at all and then folks that had elimination diets. So there have been studies where they actually had folks do no common allergens, so nuts, dairy, etc. And then folks that again had specific to their own bodies, they removed those allergens, and those that were able to identify their body's allergens and were able to remove those substances from their diet, they did have less frequent migraine attacks. They were shorter in duration, and the severity was generally reduced. So there is some evidence for elimination diets in migraine. I think that it's important to think of migraine as a biopsychosocial disease. So, what that means is that our biology or our genetics have a large part in that. Our mood and our general, like, psychological well being have a large part of that. And then again, the social environment. So, your the stigma that's associated with migraine, your ability to connect with others make a big impact too. So, in my personal opinion, if you are living with chronic migraine, I do think that it would be helpful to try to keep a food diary and see if every day that you have a migraine attack or maybe an increased severity of your baseline pain, you can log maybe what you ate before your pain built up in intensity, log if you felt a craving for any type of food at that time, and that might be able to help you identify, is it a craving, is it a true trigger, and then you could try eliminating that particular thing from your diet and seeing. In terms of doing a pure elimination diet where you get rid of multiple things all at the same time to see if it might help, I don't personally recommend doing that because, again, you might miss certain nutrients that you need. You may not be able to go out with your family and friends to eat or do other things, which can be really isolating. So in general, I would recommend that you do it kind of in a more controlled, like, observation where you watch what you did that day, see if it's a consistent pattern, and then maybe eliminate that one food. So, in terms of trying an elimination diet at home, we talked about maybe keeping a food diary, trying to note if something is a trigger versus a craving. Another thing that I would really recommend is either talking to your neurology provider or your primary care provider to see if they have a nutritionist or a dietitian that works with their office. A lot of times, this is something that your primary care provider could place a referral for, and having somebody to talk through all the things that your body might need to keep up its energy stores while also trying to respect your chronic illness might be really helpful, both in terms of things you may not have thought of as a trigger, but also ways to, again, keep your nutrition robust while trying to make your chronic disease better. something to be aware of when you do an elimination diet, again, would be trying to eliminate one thing at a time. If you eliminate a few things at a time, it might be hard to know which one made you better. Now, of course, one way to test that theory would be to reintroduce foods one at a time, but then again, there's that risk of going back into a pain cycle. So, in terms of some risks or downsides, again, there's the risk of maybe not being able to do things socially, which are really important in terms of keeping our mood up, keeping our pain down. So if your diet is really restrictive, you may not be able to go out with your family and friends. Again, there are lots of benefits to things like healthy fats, sugars, like carbohydrates that can be found in a lot of foods. So sometimes eliminating those things can make your body work in overdrive to make up for those nutritional deficits. And I think those are probably the main risks. A lot of different diets have been studied in the setting of possibly reducing migraine. So some examples are the DASH diet, which is dietary approaches to stopping hypertension. So it's something that we usually use for high blood pressure. There is the ketogenic diet, the modified Atkins diet. One diet is the high omega-3, low omega-6 diet. So there's really a lot of different diets that are not necessarily elimination diets that have been studied for migraine. But in terms of being balanced, I think really the bottom line of all of these diets is that the more whole foods that you can eat, so the less processed things, so maybe things that have less ingredients, so more whole foods, healthy meats, vegetables, versus things that have a lot of ingredients that maybe you can't pronounce. I think overall, having that higher balance of more whole foods compared to processed foods is a really good place to start. So if eliminating things completely, or if even keeping a food diary just feels like too much work, then I think that a good way to try to balance that is just to remember that to tip that balance more whole foods than processed foods. And I think that should be a good starting point. I think one of the biggest helpful pieces of advice I can give, again, is that when you are keeping a food diary and you're trying to track, really look at, again, if you were craving something that day. So it doesn't have to be that particular food, but let's say that you that day write down in your diary, I was craving something sweet. And then you look back and say, well, I ate chocolate. Again, I think keeping that track of if you had this urge and craving to eat something will really, really help decide, was I always going to have this migraine attack, or was it that particular food? So my biggest piece of advice is to look at how you were feeling that day, not just at what you ate that day. The areas of research that are most promising when it comes to looking at diet and migraine is, again, what nutrients kind of help migraine frequency and severity go down. So one of the most recent is that high omega-3, low omega-6 diet, which, again, the easiest way to think of that is omega-3s we know of as fish, certain types of nuts, but omega-6 is really just processed foods, so things high in certain oils. So really, I think the thing that's really most promising is that researchers are looking a lot more into the gut migraine connection, so the gut microbiome, or what bacteria naturally lives in our gut, and how certain foods can help improve that connection. My biggest piece of advice for incorporating diet and migraine is really to realize that diet is just one part of your treatment. So again, migraine is a biopsychosocial disease. So there's a lot of things that factor in: sleep, hydration, prescription medicines, diet, exercise. So it's really important not to look at diet in a vacuum. I think that diet is important, but I think it's also important to realize that since migraine is a genetic disease, you could have an absolutely perfect diet and you would still have attacks. So I think when folks are looking at how to maybe naturally improve their migraine, diet is important. But when we look at the whole picture, I think if you try to consistently make healthier choices rather than just focusing on like knocking out every single type of food that online said it might be a trigger. So I think if for the most part you look at making healthy choices the majority of the time, the handful of times that maybe you eat something processed or eat something that you know will trigger you won't be as big of a deal, because in the whole picture of things, those small changes lead to a persistent improvement over time. So my biggest advice would be, this is just one part of your migraine management. It's an important part, but if you're overwhelmed, don't know where to start, don't look at this as the end all be all. There's lots of things that can be managed along the way. Well, thank you all for watching. I hope that this was helpful. If you all are looking for some more resources, please check out the American Migraine Foundation website for some other help about identifying triggers, what the research tells us, and see you all next time.